Let me just, we're covering a lot of ground very fast.
And
Let me
fault.
recapitulate,
Yes.
just to make sure that we've got things absolutely clear up to
Yes.
this point. According to what we might call the strong version of logical positivism, all meaningful statements
Yes.
were of two kinds.
Yes.
If either they were empirical statements about the world,
Yes.
in which case they must make some observable difference to something,
Yes.
and therefore must be verifiable
Yes.
if they're to be meaningful.
That's right.
It doesn't mean to say they're necessarily true, because we might go
No,
try
true
and
or
verify
false.
them
No, no, no,
and find that they're not true.
Certainly,
But
certainly.
it must be possible for them to be
Yeah,
true,
yeah,
and
yes.
therefore possible for them to be verified
yes.
if they're to have any meaning. That's one lot of statements, empirical statements.
Yes.
Or they must be about mathematics or logic, in
Yes.
which case they are purely self-referential. The true ones unpack what is already in the
Yes,
premises. The false ones are self-contradictions. Is right? And if a statement is of neither of these two kinds, then it's meaningless.
That's right.
And with that as a kind of weapon, they were able to chuck overboard
Yes.
whole areas of traditional
Yes.
discourse, not only in religion and not
Yes.
only in politics, but also in philosophy and no doubt
Yes.
all other areas of life. Now, one query that occurs to one straight away is this. If we make moral judgments
Yes.
or value judgments or aesthetic judgments, it seems pretty clear that these are neither statements about the world, nor are they tautologies.
Yes.
Now, that must have been obvious to logical positivists from the start. How did they deal with this?
Well, it wasn't obvious to them that they weren't statements about the world. There's quite a long tradition in ethics which makes ethical statements what is called naturalistic, that is, statements about what is not conducive to the satisfaction of human desires or to the furtherance of human happiness and so on. And this is the view that, for example, Schlick took. He wrote a book, rather a good book, called Ethical Questions, Frage und Dialektik, in which he put forward the doctrine that what ethics is about is what human beings want and how their wants are to be satisfied. And roughly a form of utilitarianism. This is possible. Now, other people, Carnap, for instance, and also myself, took a different view. We took the view that ethical statements were much more like commands. I mean, not true or false, but I developed what's called the emotive theory, that the ethical statements were expressions of feeling. Carnap took the view that they were more like imperatives. So ethics is brought in therefore, in one of two ways, either as in a naturalistic way, as being about what conduces to human happiness, which is then a scientific matter of fact, it's a matter of psychology and sociology and so on, or being treated as not indeed metaphysical nonsense, but as being not fact-stating, either imperative or emotive.
Well, now, when they used the verification principle, like a sort of Occam's razor, I mean, slashing about right and left
Yes.
and getting rid of all sorts of things, what difference did this make to the philosophical outlook of the people who were influenced by it? Because it did have an enormous effect on the way people saw the world and the way they saw philosophy.
Well, one effect it had was one you mentioned in your opening remarks, that it made philosophers very much more self-conscious about what they were doing. I mean, they had to justify their own activity on the assumption that the natural sciences took up the field, as it were. You then had to find a place for philosophy. Philosophy wasn't, as it were, allowed to be a competitor with them. And then people became much more self-conscious about what philosophers were about. And on the whole, the Vienna Circle wasn't the only influence. There was also the influence of people like G.E. Moore in England, who were defending rather similar views for very different reasons. Moore believed, for instance, that propositions of common sense were certainly true and so on, and it could be shown that this could extend also to the sciences, that each domain had its own criteria. Through the influence of the Circle and through the influence of people like Moore, philosophers came to think that their function could be only that of analysis. And then the question arose what analysis was, how it was practiced, what were its methods, what were the criteria, etc., etc.
So that, in fact, under this stimulus, the techniques of analysis reached a degree of
That's
sophistication
right, yes.
far greater than they'd ever reached before.
That I think is so.
Would it be a not unreasonable simplification to say this, that they thought that the job of finding out about the world and describing the world
yes.
was the task of science?
That's right.
So all the various sciences were doing that.
Yes.
And therefore, it wasn't the task of philosophy to find out about the world or explain our
Yes, well,
experience.
yes, I mean, it couldn't, as it were.
No, there wasn't any space for it to occupy.
Yes.
So the task of philosophy, in fact, was to refine the methods of science, to clarify the concepts being used, to clarify the methods of argument being used, and perhaps most importantly of all, to separate out the legitimate methods of argument available to science from the illegitimate methods of argument.
you could put it in a technical way by saying that philosophy then came to be seen as a second-order subject. The first order being talking about the world, the second order being talking about the world. And I think
talk.
I think that was Gilbert Ryle's expression, that philosophy
Yes.
came to be seen as talk about talk.
Yes, yes. And now we're talking about talk.
Yes.
This brings us on to the whole area of language.
Yes.
One striking feature of logical positivism was that it brought a wholly new emphasis to bear on the importance of language in philosophy. I have a quotation here from Bertrand Russell from his book My Philosophical Development, and it's very striking in this context because he tells about how, until he was in his mid-40s,
Yes.
and it's important to remember that by that time he'd done nearly all the work for which he's
pretty
now
well,
most
pretty well all the
famous.
important work he'd
All
done,
the
yes.
important work. He said this, that until that time he, and now I'm quoting, had thought of language as transparent. That is to say, as a medium which could be employed without paying attention to it. Now, I should think it's almost certainly true that virtually all philosophers until this century took a similar view. They didn't actually turn in upon themselves and examine the medium of thought and expression, language. They used it unselfconsciously, as if you didn't have to pay attention to it, you could simply use it about the world. Now, the logical positivists took an entirely different approach to language from that, didn't they?
Yes, I think this is right. You could say that the interest in language starts very early, even with Socrates, who went around asking his fellow citizens what is justice, what is knowledge, what is perception, and so on, what is courage. But he didn't see these, I think, as verbal questions. I think Plato saw them as questions about the nature of abstract entities, which he thought of as being real. They weren't seen as verbal questions, although in retrospect one can see them as having been questions about meanings, at least. I think that it probably does start only at the beginning of this century, this extremely conscious preoccupation with language. Wittgenstein and Russell, at the beginning of the century, were interested in the relation between language and the world. This was the great problem of Wittgenstein, the problem which the Tractatus was meant to be an answer to. And, of course, he ended by saying it couldn't be described, but only shown. But the intense preoccupation of philosophers with the way that language functions perhaps begins only in quite a late period after the last war.
It leads philosophers into a situation where as soon as anyone makes an assertion of any kind about the world, what you then do is examine the assertion. And you get straight away into the examination of statements, the analysis of propositions, an analysis of the relation of the terms of the proposition to each other, its logical form, and so on and so forth. And philosophy can soon seem to become, on that basis, about language. And indeed, it would be true to say, wouldn't it, that a lot of non-philosophers have acquired the view that philosophers are only concerned with language, and sometimes this is put disparagingly, that they're only playing with words. Can you give some explanation of why that sort of prejudice against philosophy, which is very widespread, is misplaced?
Well, a great deal of philosophy certainly is about language, and as far as it distinguishes between different types of utterance and analyzes certain types of expression. I think the main, I would make no apology for this, but beyond that, I think the answer I would give is that the distinction between being about language and being about the world isn't all that sharp, because the world is the world as we describe it. The world is the world as it figures in our system of concepts. And in exploring our system of concepts, you are at the same time exploring the world. Let's take an example. Suppose now one is interested in the question of causality. Now, and we certainly believe that causality is something that happens in the world. I'm bitten by the Anopheles mosquito, I get malaria and so on, one thing causes another. And one can put it by saying, what is causality? And this is a perfectly respectable, important, traditional philosophical question. You can also put it by saying, how do we analyze causal statements? What do we mean by saying what one thing causes another? And in fact, although you look as though you're posing a purely linguistic question, you're answering exactly the same question as philosophers have always posed, only putting it in a different form, and we think, or most contemporary philosophers, a rather clearer form. Now, the point is that I think that there was a time, I think the fashion has passed, it happened about 20 years ago, and came to be known as the philosophy of the Oxford School, mainly through the work of a particular philosopher called John Austin. It wasn't universal even then, when philosophers were a bit inclined to study usage for its own sake. without seeing it as a means of solving any problems. And this, I think, is sterile.
That did become arid. I
Did
quite
become
agree
arid,
with that,
sterile.
yes.
But I think mostly now, when people try to investigate the meanings of words, it is because these are concepts they're studying, which do play an important part in our description of what we think the world is really like. I mean,